He was just an old farmer in patched clothes, clutching a small envelope of savings barely enough to buy a saddle, let alone a horse. Yet, when Henry Walker raised his trembling hand at the grand auction, the crowd erupted in cruel laughter. What none of them knew was that this humiliation would ignite a chain of events, revealing a hidden truth, a long-buried promise, and a moment that would silence every mocking voice forever. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the endless fields of Montana, painting the sky with strokes of gold and crimson. At the edge of those rolling plains stood a weathered wooden cabin, its paint long peeled by the wind, its windows cloudy with age. Inside lived Henry Walker, a man whose body had grown thin from years of labor and whose hair had turned as gray as the ashes in the cold hearth. His hands, rough and scarred, still carried the strength of someone who had known nothing but work and sacrifice. Henry rose with the dawn and rested only when the stars appeared, tending to his small patch of land. His fields were nothing like the vast ranches that sprawled across Montana, where wealthy cattlemen raised hundreds of horses and cattle. His was a modest life, a few rows of vegetables, a handful of chickens, and a barn so fragile it creaked in every gust of wind. He survived, but just barely. For many in town, Henry was invisible, an old man living at the edge of nowhere, a relic of a harder time. Yet beneath that worn-out frame beat a heart that carried a promise, one made decades ago, under the wide-open sky. Henry remembered the voice of Samuel Hayes, the man who had found him as an orphan boy and given him shelter. Samuel had taught him about the soil, the wind, the ways of horses, and the silent language between man and beast. One evening, as they leaned against the fence watching Samuel's old chestnut stallion graze, Samuel had said, "One day, Henry, you'll have a horse of your own, and when you do, you'll understand it's not just an animal, it's a part of your soul," Henry had promised. He swore that no matter how long it took, he would keep that vow. But life had a cruel way of stealing dreams. Samuel passed away, and Henry was left with nothing but that memory. Years later, when he built a life with his beloved wife Mary, the promise still lingered. Mary knew about it too. She would smile gently when Henry's eyes followed a rider passing through the valley, and she would whisper, "One day, Henry, one day you'll ride too." But Mary was gone now, taken too soon by illness. Henry had sold everything he could to pay the doctors, even the little heirlooms she cherished. The house felt colder without her laughter, the evenings lonelier without her sitting by the fire. Still, her final words clung to his heart. "Don't let that dream die, Henry. Samuel believed in you, and so do I." That was why, on this very morning, Henry had woken with a sense of urgency. Today was the annual horse auction in town. Every summer, breeders, ranchers, and wealthy families gathered in the county fairgrounds to buy and sell their finest stock. Horses of every color and breed would be paraded before crowds, fetching prices that could buy an entire farm. Henry knew his pocket held only a few $100s money he had saved for years, denying himself every comfort, but it was all he had. He cleaned his only white shirt, the fabric thin and patched at the elbows, and pressed it carefully. He polished his worn leather boots until they looked almost respectable. Then, with trembling hands, he slipped the envelope of money into his coat pocket. His heart beat with a mixture of fear and hope. He was no fool. He knew he could never compete with the wealthy ranchers. But sometimes, fate offered second chances, and Henry believed that maybe, just maybe, there might be one horse overlooked, one soul waiting for him. As he stepped out of the cabin, the crisp Montana air filled his lungs. The prairie stretched endlessly, golden under the sinking Sunday. For a moment, he closed his eyes and pictured Mary standing at the porch, her soft smile urging him forward. He imagined Samuel, strong and patient, tipping his hat in approval. Those visions carried him down the dirt road, toward the town that would soon gather under the auctioneer's call. Henry walked slowly, each step heavy but determined. The dust clung to his boots, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of years. Yet his spirit, fragile as it seemed, burned with the stubborn flame of a man who refused to let go of his word. He whispered under his breath, as if to Samuel and Mary both, "I'll do it today. I don't know how, but I will." By the time he reached the fairgrounds, lanterns were already being lit. He could hear the laughter of wealthy men, the jingling of spurs, the rustle of silk dresses as ranchers' wives paraded in jewels brighter than the evening star. Horses neighed in their stalls, their sleek coats shimmering under the last light. Henry paused at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. The contrast was painful. He stood in his patched shirt, his sunburned face lined with hardship, while around him were polished boots, tailored jackets, and wide-brimmed hats that gleamed with silver bands. No one spared him more than a passing glance, yet Henry felt every pair of eyes like a weight pressing him down. Still, he stepped forward. He had not come to fit in. He had come to fulfill a promise, one that had survived 50 years of poverty, loss, and heartbreak. And though the odds were cruelly stacked against him, Henry knew this was his only chance. He clenched the envelope tighter, the crinkle of paper sharp in his palm, and whispered once more, "For Samuel, for Mary, for me." Then, with quiet dignity, he walked through the gates, into the world that would soon test not just his will but the very soul of his dream. The county fairgrounds were alive with noise and color, a place transformed each year into a carnival of wealth and ambition. Strings of lanterns swung above the wooden pens, their yellow light flickering over polished saddles and shining coats of horses. The scent of hay mixed with roasted corn and dust, creating an air that was both festive and tense. For many, this was more than just a market. It was a stage where reputations were built and power displayed. Henry Walker walked slowly along the edge of the crowd, his eyes darting to the horses tethered in their stalls. Sleek black thoroughbreds stamped their hooves, their muscles rippling like shadows in motion. Golden palominos tossed their heads, manes gleaming in the lamplight. Even the foals, barely steady on their legs, had pedigrees that would soon fetch sums beyond Henry's imagination. The people milling about seemed as dazzling as the animals. Women wore long dresses stitched from satin, their laughter ringing like bells as they adjusted diamond brooches. Men with polished boots and silver-banded hats slapped each other's backs, their voices booming as they bragged about cattle herds and land holdings. Henry's patched shirt and faded boots set him apart instantly. He could feel the curious stares of strangers, some amused, some dismissive, as if wondering why an old man with sun-worn skin had wandered into a place reserved for prosperity. At the center of it all stood the auction block, a raised wooden platform where each horse would be paraded under the scrutiny of buyers. The auctioneer, a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice, rehearsed his chant with rhythmic speed. Assistants led a magnificent black stallion across the stage, its coat shining like oil. The crowd leaned forward, eager, the tension sharp as the first numbers rang out. $10,000 to start, the auctioneer barked. Bidding erupted like gunfire. Voices shot from every corner, numbers climbing higher and higher until the stallion sold for a take price that could have bought Henry's entire farm 10 times over. Cheers and applause followed as the proud new owner, a rancher in a velvet vest, shook hands with friends. Henry shrank back into the last row of benches. His envelope felt heavy in his pocket, though its contents were pitiful compared to the stacks of bills flying around him. Still, he refused to turn away. He had not come to watch wealth change hands. He had come to wait for an opening, a moment when fortune might forget its favorites. More horses were paraded out sleek bays, glossy paints, even a gray mare with a bloodline traced back to champions. Each time, the bidding rose swiftly, outpacing Henry before he could even consider raising his hand. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain seated as one after another disappeared into the hands of men who laughed loudly, already planning to stable their new prizes. The crowd's attention was drawn most toward a group of young men at the front, sons of ranchers, brash and entitled. Among them was Tommy Reed, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in clothes that looked freshly bought for the occasion. Tommy was the son of Richard Reed, owner of the largest ranch in the valley, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Tommy joked loudly with his companions, pointing at each horse with exaggerated gestures, driving the bidding higher just for sport. The auctioneer indulged him, eager to keep the energy alive, while the crowd laughed at every arrogant remark. It wasn't about the animals for Tommy. It was about power, about reminding everyone in the room that his family's wealth was unshakable. Henry tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the quieter horses. His eyes settled on a bay mare standing near the edge of the pen, not as young or as sleek as the others, but with a steady gaze that reminded him of Samuel's old Blaze. The mare pawed the ground once, then lifted her head, meeting Henry's eyes across the distance. Something stirred in him, a memory, a feeling, as if the animal itself were calling out for him. Finally, the auctioneer waved toward the mare. His voice, which had thundered moments ago for a prized stallion, softened. "We'll start this one at $500. Silence filled the hall. The wealthy ranchers exchanged glances, uninterested. For them, the mare was ordinary, not worth their time. Some turned back to their drinks, others to their conversations. Henry's heart pounded, his hand rose, trembling but certain. 500, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 6? For a moment, the only sound was the shuffle of boots on sawdust. Henry dared to hope. His chest tightened, ready to believe that this could be the chance Samuel and Mary had spoken of, that maybe the universe had finally carved a space for him in its grand design. But then, a mocking voice cut through the silence. Well, look who thinks he belongs here. It was Tommy Reed, his grin spreading wide as he twisted in his seat to face Henry. The old farmer wants a horse. Tell me, Walker, what'll you feed it? Your last sack of potatoes? Laughter erupted from his friends, rolling across the hall like thunder. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably, his gavel poised in midair. Henry's throat burned, his hand trembled, but he kept it raised. I have my savings, he said quietly, though his voice barely carried beyond the first rows. Your savings? Tommy scoffed, springing to his feet with theatrical flair. Well then, I'll give 1,000, just so everyone knows what a real bid looks like. The crowd roared again, some amused, others uneasy but unwilling to challenge the Reeds. Henry's face flushed, his envelope of bills suddenly feeling smaller than ever. Still, he clung to it, refusing to lower his hand. 1,000, the auctioneer echoed, relief in his tone. Do I hear 11? Henry's lips parted, the words caught in his chest. His hand hovered, but he knew the truth: his money would never stretch far enough. Yet his heart screamed against surrender. He whispered to himself, so low no one else could hear, "Not yet. I can't let go. Not yet." And so the night pressed forward, the laughter of the rich echoing in his ears, the promise of a lifetime slipping further from his grasp. The hall seemed to shrink around Henry as every eye turned toward him. The sound of Tommy Reed's derision still hung in the air, louder than the crack of a whip. For the wealthy young rancher, humiliating Henry was nothing more than a game, a way to draw laughter from his friends. For Henry, it was a knife turned in a wound that had never healed. The auctioneer hesitated, tapping the gavel against his palm. His booming voice, so confident when shouting high numbers for prized horses, now faltered. 1,000 to Mr. Reed, he announced, almost apologetically. Do I hear 11? 1,100? No answer came. The room was heavy with anticipation, the silence broken only by the restless shifting of horses in their pens outside. Henry could feel the weight of his envelope in his pocket, the crinkle of thin paper against his chest. He thought of Mary's soft voice urging him not to give up, of Samuel's steady gaze the day he made his promise. Slowly, painfully, Henry lifted his hand higher. 1,100, he whispered, his voice raw but firm. For a heartbeat, there was silence, stunned silence. Then Tommy's grin widened like a wolf scenting prey. Did everyone hear that? He crowed. The old man's willing to spend his life savings on a nag. His companions burst into laughter, slapping their knees, their voices carrying over the crowd. Some people shifted uneasily, but no one spoke up. 2,000, Tommy declared with a flourish, bowing as though he were an actor on stage. Gasps echoed from a few in the crowd. The mare wasn't worth that, much not in pedigree, not in training. But for Tommy, the money meant nothing. What mattered was crushing Henry in front of everyone, proving once more that poverty had no place among the rich. Henry's heart dropped, his hand trembled, still raised, as his mind raced. 2,000. It was impossible. He had only a fraction of that, saved over years of denying himself everything. His throat tightened, and the words he longed to say refused to come. 2,000 to Mr. Reed, the auctioneer said, relief flooding his tone. Going once, going twice, Henry tried. His lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes stung as the mare looked at him, her calm gaze steady as if she knew the battle he was losing. He wanted to cry out, to fight, but the walls of wealth and laughter around him were too high. Sold, the gavel came down, sharp and final. Applause filled the air, mixed with cruel laughter. Tommy turned in his seat, sweeping off his hat in a mocking bow toward Henry. Don't worry, Walker. I don't even want the horse. I just wanted everyone to know this isn't your kind of place. The hall erupted once more, some laughing with Tommy, others smiling nervously, unwilling to cross him. For Henry, the sound was deafening. Each laugh seemed to press him lower into his seat, each mocking glance another weight on his shoulders. He stood slowly, his knees stiff, his head bowed. The envelope in his pocket felt like nothing now, scraps of paper against the tide of wealth that had drowned him. As he turned toward the doors, the crowd parted just enough to let him through. He could feel their eyes on him, the sting of pity worse than the sting of ridicule. Outside, the night air hit him like a wave. The fairground lights glittered behind him, the echoes of laughter chasing him across the gravel. He walked past the pens where the remaining horses waited, their breath rising in white clouds against the dark. One of them snorted softly as he passed, and Henry paused, his chest aching. He had dreamed of walking away from such a place with a horse at his side. Instead, he was leaving with nothing but shame. He clenched his jaw, forcing back the tears that threatened to fall. He would not let them see him broken, not even Tommy Reed. Pride was the only possession he had left, and though battered, it was still his. Henry made his way toward the far fence, where the glow of lanterns faded and the quiet of the Montana night took hold. Above him, stars pricked through the velvet sky, ancient and unchanging, uncaring of the pain of one poor farmer. He leaned against the fence, drawing in a ragged breath, trying to steady the storm in his chest. It was then he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, not mocking like the laughter he had fled, but heavy, purposeful. He turned, startled, to find a man approaching, older, tall, with a presence that commanded attention even without a word. The stranger's hat shadowed his face, but his posture spoke of wealth and authority carried with quiet confidence rather than arrogance. "Mr. Walker," the man said, his voice low and steady, "would you spare me a moment of your time?" Henry blinked, confused. He didn't know the man, but something in his tone carried no trace of mockery, only curiosity. For the first time that night, Henry felt the laughter of the hall begin to fade, replaced by the faintest spark of something else, something he couldn't yet name. Henry froze at the sound of the stranger's voice, unsure whether to turn or keep walking into the shadows. His pride told him to leave, to vanish into the night before anyone else could add to his humiliation. But something in that steady tone stopped him, and against his instincts, he faced the man. The stranger stepped closer, the glow of a nearby lantern falling across his face. He was perhaps in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that spoke of wealth, but not extravagance. His grey eyes studied Henry with an intensity that made him uneasy, as if searching for something buried beneath the lines of his weathered face. "Mr. Walker," the man repeated, tipping his hat politely. "My name is Richard Cole. I couldn't help but notice what happened back there." Henry stiffened, his jaw tightening. He hated pity most of all, and he braced himself for another polite dismissal, another reminder that he didn't belong. "I've no business with rich men tonight," he muttered, turning back toward the dirt road. But Richard did not step aside. Instead, he placed a hand on the fence rail, blocking Henry's path with quiet authority. "I'm not here to mock you," he said gently. "In fact, I admire the courage it took to stand in there, knowing the odds against you." Henry looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his features. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such respect. He searched Richard's eyes for insincerity but found none. "I don't need admiration," Henry said finally. His voice was low, almost weary. "What I needed was that horse, and I lost it." Richard's gaze softened. "Perhaps, but sometimes what we think we've lost is only the beginning of something else." Henry frowned at the riddle-like words, unwilling to be comforted. The sting of defeat was too fresh. The laughter of Tommy Reed and his friends still rang in his ears, echoing louder than the auctioneer's gavel. He could still see the mare's steady eyes, could still feel the moment hope slipped from his grasp. His chest tightened. 50 years of waiting, of carrying Samuel's promise like a lantern through the dark, and it had ended with ridicule. He thought of Mary, of her last request, and shame stabbed at him. He had failed her too. "I saved for years," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "I went without food, without firewood some winters. I buried my wife with nothing left but this envelope, and still, I kept it, for tonight. And what did it buy me?" Laughter. The words tore from him like a confession, raw and bitter. He sank onto the fence rail, his shoulders slumping. The weight of his years, his losses, pressed down on him until it was hard to breathe. Richard stood silently, his expression unreadable. The fairground noise carried faintly on the wind, another horse being led across the stage, more numbers shouted, another round of applause. Life continued inside, indifferent to the broken man outside. At last Richard spoke, his voice firm but quiet. You haven't failed, Mr. Walker. Not yet. Henry shook his head. You didn't hear them. You didn't see their faces. I was a fool to believe I belonged in that hall. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. Their laughter doesn't define you. You've lived a life most of them couldn't survive for a week. You've worked land with your bare hands. You've carried burdens they've never known. That isn't failure. Henry let out a bitter laugh. Fine words, but they don't put a horse in my barn. They don't keep a promise. Richard hesitated, studying Henry once more. For a moment, his expression changed nostalgia, recognition, something that flickered like a memory half remembered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though holding back a truth not yet ready to be spoken. Instead, he rested his hand on the fence beside Henry. Mr. Walker, I have an estate in Wyoming, not far from here. I would like you to come with me tonight. There's something I believe you should see. Henry looked at him in disbelief. Why? What business would a man like you have with a farmer like me? Richard's gray eyes met his, unwavering. Because when I looked at you tonight, I felt as though I'd seen you before, long ago, and I don't believe in coincidences. Henry's breath caught. He searched Richard's face again, but the memory would not come. Still, something about the man unsettled him, a familiarity he could not explain. The night stretched quiet between them. Beyond the fence, the prairie wind stirred the tall grass, whispering like voices from another time. Henry thought of Samuel, of Mary, of promises broken and unbroken. He thought of the mare's eyes, of Tommy's laughter, of his own humiliation. And he thought of the stranger before him, offering not charity, but mystery. Finally, Henry pushed himself to his feet. His voice was steady, though his heart trembled. All right, Mr. Cole, show me what you mean. Richard nodded once, a hint of relief in his expression. He gestured toward a waiting carriage at the edge of the fairground. Together, they began to walk, leaving behind the bright lights and cruel laughter of the auction. For Henry, defeat still weighed heavy. But as the stars wheeled overhead and the night swallowed the fairground behind him, he felt the faintest shift in the air, like the first stirrings of a wind that could change the course of his life. The wagon rattled softly along the dirt road, its wooden wheels crunching over gravel as the fairground lights dwindled behind them. Henry sat stiffly on the bench seat beside Richard Cole, his hands clasped tight in his lap. The night air was sharp, tinged with the scent of sagebrush and pine, and the silence between the two men grew heavier with each mile. Henry's thoughts churned. He could still hear Tommy Reed's mocking laughter ringing in his ears, see the smug bow that had reduced him to a fool in front of the entire town. Every jolt of the wagon seemed to hammer the truth deeper. He had failed, yet beside him sat this stranger, composed and quiet, who had pulled him out of the shadows with an invitation Henry still couldn't quite understand. Finally, Henry broke the silence. I don't know why I'm here. You don't owe me a thing, Mr. Cole. I'm just a poor farmer with nothing to offer. Richard kept his eyes on the road, the reins steady in his hands. You may see yourself that way, but I see something else. I saw a man stand his ground tonight when the world laughed at him. That takes a kind of strength money can't buy. Henry turned to study him, the flickering lantern on the wagon casting sharp lines across Richard's face. The man carried himself with ease, but not the arrogance of men like Tommy Reed. There was gravity in his tone, a quiet dignity Henry rarely encountered among the wealthy. Still, suspicion gnawed at him. So what is it you want from me? Charity? Gratitude? Richard shook his head. Neither. What I want is to understand why that horse mattered so much to you. You weren't bidding for profit or prestige. Your eyes told a different story. Henry looked away, staring into the darkness where the prairie stretched endlessly. Memories pressed at him, heavy and insistent. Samuel's voice, Mary's smile, the weight of a promise carried too long. He clenched his jaw, unwilling to spill his soul to a stranger. Yet something in Richard's steady presence drew the words from him, piece by piece. It was never just about a horse, Henry said at last, his voice rough. It was about keeping a promise I made 50 years ago, to the man who raised me when I had no one else. Richard glanced at him, but said nothing. The reins creaked as the horses pulled the wagon up, a gentle rise. Henry exhaled slowly. Samuel Hayes, that was his name. He took me in when I was just a boy, barely old enough to remember my own parents. He taught me how to work the land, how to mend fences, how to listen to the wind. But more than anything, he taught me about horses. He had one, a chestnut stallion named Blaze. They understood each other like they spoke the same language. I used to sit for hours just watching them. Samuel told me one day I'd have a horse of my own, and that when I did, I'd understand what it meant to truly belong somewhere. I swore to him I would. His voice faltered. He could still see Blaze's gleaming coat in the sun, still hear Samuel's deep laugh as the horse nudged his shoulder, but Samuel got sick. We sold Blaze to pay for medicine, and it still wasn't enough. I buried Samuel with nothing left but that promise, and then life. Life had other plans. I worked, I built what little I could, I married Mary. She believed in me, even when I stopped believing in myself. Before she passed, she told me not to let the dream die, so I saved. For years, I saved every penny. Tonight was supposed to be the night I kept that promise. The words caught in his throat. He turned his face away, ashamed of the tears burning his eyes. Instead, I was made a fool. For a long moment, only the creak of the wagon filled the silence. Then Richard spoke, his voice low and steady. I knew Samuel Hayes. Henry's head snapped around, disbelief etched across his features. You, what did you say? Richard's gaze stayed fixed on the dark road ahead. I knew him. Years ago. I visited his farm one summer when I was a boy. My uncle, Samuel Hayes. He paused, his hands tightening on the reins, and I remember seeing a child there, a thin boy with wild hair, following Blaze across the pasture like the horse was his whole world. Henry's breath hitched. A chill swept through him, not from the night air but from recognition. He searched his memory, fragments rising like smoke. A young boy dressed in finer clothes than he'd ever owned, standing awkwardly by the fence, watching Blaze with wide eyes. His voice was a whisper. That was you? Richard nodded once. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes glimmered with something that looked very much like old sorrow. I never forgot that summer, and when I saw you tonight, I thought perhaps fate had brought us together again. Henry sat frozen, his mind reeling. For 50 years he had carried Samuel's memory alone, convinced the world had forgotten. Yet here was proof that someone else remembered too, someone tied to Samuel by blood, someone who had glimpsed that same farm, that same horse, that same promise. The wagon rolled on, the prairie opening before them under a sky full of stars. Henry's defeat still clung to him, but now it was tangled with something else. Confusion, wonder, the faint stirring of hope. He finally found his voice. Why me, Mr. Cole? Why now? Richard's eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. Because some promises are too important to die, and I believe Samuel meant for you to keep yours. That's why I asked you to come. There's something I want you to see, something I think Samuel would have wanted you to see. Henry said nothing more. He sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing in, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. He didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time since Mary's passing, he felt the faintest spark that his story was not yet over. The road stretched endlessly across the prairie, the wagon wheels grinding against dirt and stone. Above them, stars spilled across the sky in countless sparks of silver. Henry sat in silence, his mind swirling with the stranger's revelation. Richard Cole was not simply a wealthy rancher passing by, he was blood of Samuel Hayes, the man who had shaped Henry's childhood and given meaning to his life. The coincidence was too sharp, too uncanny. It felt as though the past had reached out and placed its hand firmly on his shoulder. For miles, Henry said nothing, lost in the collision of memory and disbelief. He remembered Samuel's voice, the warm timbre that had carried lessons of patience and strength. He remembered Blaze's steady gait, the way the horse had seemed to sense his every thought. And now this man beside him claimed to be part of that story, part of the life Henry thought had vanished forever when the farm was sold and Samuel buried. Finally, Richard broke the silence. You spoke of a promise, he said, his voice low. What exactly did Samuel ask of you? Henry swallowed hard, the ache in his throat rising. It was more than a request, it was a vow. He stared into the darkness, seeing not the prairie but a younger version of himself, barefoot and thin, standing beside Samuel by the corral. He told me once that a man and his horse are bound in a way few can understand, that it isn't about ownership or pride, it's about trust, a bond of souls. He made me promise I'd have one someday, a horse of my own, and that I'd honor that bond. I swore I would, even if it took my whole life. His hands tightened in his lap, the veins in his arms standing out. But life doesn't wait for promises. Samuel fell sick, the farm couldn't hold itself together, and we sold Blaze. After that I had nothing but work. When Mary came into my life I tried again. She believed in that dream, even when I was too tired to believe in it myself. And when she was dying, she told me to keep the promise, to Samuel and to her. That's why I came tonight. That's why I faced their laughter, because it wasn't just about me, it was about them too. The words hung heavy in the night, thick with grief and devotion. Richard guided the reins with a steady hand, his jaw set in thought. Samuel spoke the same way to me, he said after a moment. I was only a boy then, visiting for the summer. My father hated that farm. He thought it was small, beneath our family's name. But my mother insisted I spend time with her brother. Samuel used to tell me things I didn't understand back then. He said the earth had a language, that animals carried truths men were too proud to hear. I thought he was just a farmer's dreamer. Now I see he was giving us both something greater. Henry turned sharply, his eyes searching Richard's face. You mean he said those words to you too? Richard nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Almost the same. He told me once that if I ever forgot how to listen, I'd never truly understand the world around me. I didn't understand it then, but hearing your story now, I think I finally do. Henry's chest ached, not with pain but with the weight of recognition. Samuel's voice was alive between them, echoing across decades, binding two men who had walked very different paths. The wagon slowed as they reached a ridge. Richard drew the horses to a stop and gestured toward the horizon. Look, Henry followed his gaze. From the crest of the hill, he could see the valley stretched wide below, bathed in silver light. In the distance, faint lanterns glimmered around what must have been Richard's ranch. But what drew Henry's breath were the shapes moving across the open pasture horses, dozens of them, their silhouettes graceful against the night. Some trotted, others grazed, their manes flowing like ribbons in the wind. The sound of their hooves carried faintly, like a drumbeat of the earth itself. His eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. It's been so long, he whispered, since I've seen a herd like that, since I've felt close to them. Richard studied him quietly. Then tonight, you'll feel it again. You'll remember what Samuel taught you, because I believe he meant for this moment to come. Henry shook his head, struggling between hope and despair. I can't. I had my chance. I tried and I failed. You saw it. You didn't fail, Richard said firmly. You stood your ground. You raised your hand when no one else would. That's what Samuel admired most, courage. And I see it in you still. The words struck Henry with unexpected force. For years he had carried only the weight of loss. Samuel gone, Mary gone, Blaze gone. To hear another speak of him with admiration, to hear Samuel's name wrapped in reverence once more, it stirred something long dormant. For the first time that night, Henry's voice steadied. Do you really think Samuel would be proud of me? After all these years of waiting, of stumbling, of falling short? Richard turned toward him, his gray eyes catching the starlight. I don't think, I know. The wagon jolted forward again, rolling down the slope toward the ranch lights below. Henry sat back, his heart racing, his mind torn between disbelief and the faintest flicker of faith. The promise he thought buried with Samuel and Mary now breathed again, fragile but alive. As the valley opened before them and the silhouettes of horses moved like shadows across the grass, Henry realized this journey was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what he might still become. The road into Richard Cole's ranch wound between rows of cottonwoods that whispered in the night breeze. Lanterns flickered from the porches of bunkhouses, where ranch hands settled after a long day, their voices carrying faintly through the stillness. Henry sat in silence on the wagon bench, staring at the glow of the main house ahead. His heart ached with memories he had kept buried for too long, and with Richard's questions still echoing in his ears, he found himself dragged backward into the corridors of his past. Mary's face rose before him, bright, laughing, framed by strands of auburn hair that glowed in the sunlight. He could see her as clearly as the day they met, in the town's small market, when she had haggled with him over the price of tomatoes. He had been a clumsy, tongue-tied man then, his life filled with dirt and sweat and little else. But when her eyes met his, warm and unafraid, something had shifted inside him. They married within months, building a life not with riches but with devotion. Their home was no palace, but Mary filled it with warmth. She sewed curtains from scraps of fabric, planted flowers along the path, and filled the evenings with her voice, sometimes singing, sometimes reading aloud, from the few books they owned. Henry, who had once known only work and silence, discovered what it meant to laugh, to dream, to share burdens without shame. Yet their greatest dream eluded them. Mary longed for children, but after years of disappointment, the truth became undeniable. She would never bear a child. Henry remembered the nights he found her crying quietly, believing herself broken. He would hold her, whispering that she was enough, more than enough, that they could still build something beautiful together. And they did. They turned their meager plot into a small haven, rows of vegetables thriving beside bright marigolds, apple trees arching toward the sky. For a time, it seemed enough. They made a life out of resilience, out of love. But love, no matter how strong, could not keep sickness at bay. Henry's chest tightened as he remembered the first signs. Mary's fatigue, the pallor in her cheeks, the cough that refused to leave. At first they dismissed it as exhaustion, the wear of hard work and long days. But as months passed, her strength ebbed, and the truth grew impossible to deny. Doctors came and went, their words heavy and clinical. Henry sold tools, furniture, even his father's watch, to pay for medicine that offered only fleeting relief. Through it all, Mary's spirit remained unbroken. She smiled through her pain, tended her flowers when she could, and told Henry stories at night to keep his mind from despair. But he could see the light fading from her eyes, the weight of each breath growing heavier. He sat by her bedside, his hands rough and clumsy as he tried to cool her fevered brow, his heart breaking with every hour. On one of those nights, when the moonlight fell through the window and painted her face in silver, she had taken his hand and pressed it weakly to her chest. "Henry," she whispered, her voice fragile as a breeze, "you can't let the dream die with me." He tried to hush her, to tell her to rest, but she squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "You promised Samuel, remember? And you promised me. Don't let poverty or grief steal that from you. Someday, you must ride. Someday, you must find that horse. Not just for you, for us." Tears burned Henry's eyes as he bent to kiss her hand. "Mary, I can't do this without you." "Yes, you can," she breathed. "Because I'll still be there. Every time the wind touches your face, every time the earth shakes beneath hooves, I'll be there. But you must keep the promise." She passed weeks later, her final smile lingering in his memory like a flame that refused to die. Henry buried her beneath the apple tree she had planted, the blossoms falling gently over her grave, as though the earth itself wept with him. From that day on, he was a different man, quieter, lonelier, but still carrying that last request. The envelope of money became more than savings. It became sacred. Every coin dropped into it was a prayer. Every dollar earned a step toward fulfilling the vow that bound his heart. When the years grew hard, when his back ached and his spirit faltered, he clung to the thought of Mary's voice. "Don't let the dream die with me." Now, sitting beside Richard Cole with the valley opening before them, the weight of those memories pressed so heavily that Henry could scarcely breathe. He had failed at the auction, humiliated and powerless, and yet here was this man, this stranger who was not a stranger, telling him the promise still lived. Henry spoke at last, his voice raw. "I loved her more than life itself, and when I couldn't save her, I swore I'd save this dream. But tonight, I thought it slipped away forever." Richard guided the wagon carefully down the slope, his face lined with empathy. "Dreams that survive loss are the ones that matter most. Samuel knew it, Mary knew it, and now you must believe it too." Henry turned away, staring at the herd of horses grazing in the moonlight. His vision, blurred with tears, but for the first time in years, he let them fall freely. The road to this moment had been carved by both love and loss, and as the wind brushed his cheek, he felt Mary's words once again. "Every time the earth shakes beneath hooves, I'll be there." He bowed his head, whispering into the night, "Then let me not fail you now." The wagon creaked as it descended into the valley, the ranch lights ahead glowing like a constellation anchored to the earth. The air had cooled, sharp with the scent of sage and the distant musk of horses. Henry sat with his shoulders slumped, exhausted by the weight of everything he had just confessed. His voice still trembled from speaking Mary's name aloud, as though the wound of her absence had been torn open anew. Beside him, Richard Cole remained quiet. He held the reins steady, his eyes fixed on the winding path. The silence stretched between them, heavy and deliberate. Henry had expected questions, or perhaps polite words meant to soften the grief he had exposed. Instead, Richard offered nothing, no interruption, no comfort, only silence that seemed to deepen with each passing minute. At first, Henry bristled. He had laid his heart bare, told stories he had kept locked away for decades, and the man beside him gave no response. The silence stung more than mockery might have. But as the horses pulled them farther into the valley, Henry began to realize there was something different about Richard's quiet. It was not indifference. It was the silence of a man listening, weighing, carrying his own burden of thought. The wagon rolled past a long wooden fence, behind which several horses stirred, their silhouettes dark against the moonlit grass. Their gentle movements, the occasional snort or stamp of hooves, filled the night with a rhythm older than words. Henry found himself listening to them, letting the silence become less of a void and more of a presence, like Samuel used to do when watching Blaze. Richard finally spoke, his voice low and careful, as if breaking the quiet required effort. "You loved her deeply," he said. It was not a question, not a platitude, but a statement of fact. Henry swallowed hard. "More than life. She was the reason I kept going when everything else fell apart." Richard nodded once, his gaze still ahead. Then he fell silent again, and Henry felt frustration rise. "You ask me for my story, and when I give it, you sit there like a stone. What is it you're not saying, Mr. Cole?" The older man's jaw tightened, his grip on the reins firming until the leather creaked. For a long moment he said nothing, and Henry thought he would remain locked in silence forever. But then Richard exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry years of unspoken memory. "There are truths," he said quietly, "that are harder to carry than silence. Sometimes a man keeps them locked away, not because he doesn't trust others, but because speaking them out loud feels like tearing open a scar." Henry studied him in the dim light. Richard's profile was etched with lines of weariness, but there was something else there, regret, heavy and unyielding. "So what truth is it you've been keeping?" Henry asked. Richard's hands twitched on the reins, but he did not answer right away. They rode past another stretch of fence, where a group of horses grazed peacefully, their coats glimmering faintly under the moon. "Finally," Richard said, "Samuel wasn't just my uncle. He was the only member of my family who treated me as though I mattered." Henry blinked. He had not expected that. "My father was a man of power, a rancher whose only measure of worth was profit," Richard continued. "He saw me as an heir to his empire, nothing more. But Samuel spoke to me like I was a boy with a soul. He gave me summers of freedom, of learning things no school or book could ever teach. And then one summer, he introduced me to a child he had taken in. A boy who had no family, no name worth remembering, but who looked at Blaze with a devotion I had never seen in another human being." Henry's breath caught. The image was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, a boy in finer clothes, awkward but curious, standing by the fence. The memory he had dismissed as a blur now sharpened into clarity. "That was you," Richard said, finally turning to meet Henry's eyes. "I remember you, though you were small and thin. You followed Blaze everywhere, and Samuel looked at you with pride in his eyes. He once told me you would grow into a man stronger than either of us could imagine. He believed in you." Henry's throat closed. He gripped the edge of the wagon seat, his hands trembling. To hear Samuel's voice echo through Richard, after so many years of carrying it alone, was almost unbearable. "And yet you never sought me out," he rasped. "All these years, you knew of me, and you let me drift into nothing?" Richard flinched at the words, his silence now heavier than ever. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with guilt. "I was young. My father sent me away to Europe for business. By the time I returned, Samuel was gone, and the farm had been sold. I searched for news, but you had vanished. I told myself I had tried, but the truth is, I didn't try hard enough." The wagon slowed as they approached the ranch house, a sprawling structure built of stone and timber, glowing with lamplight. Yet Henry barely saw it. His chest ached with anger, sorrow, and a flicker of something else, recognition perhaps, that this man had carried his own failures as heavily as Henry carried his. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves, the sigh of the wind through the trees, and the faint creak of leather. At last, Henry whispered, almost to himself, "So all these years, Samuel's words lived in both of us, and yet neither of us kept the promise." Richard's face tightened, but he did not argue. He guided the horses to a stop in front of the ranch. Then, without looking at Henry, he said softly, "Maybe it isn't too late for either of us." The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the weight of what had been lost and the fragile hope of what might still be found. The lamps of Richard Cole's ranch cast long golden beams across the yard, illuminating corrals, stables, and the quiet movement of ranch hands finishing their nightly duties. The wagon creaked to a halt near the main house, and Henry climbed down stiffly, his legs aching from the long ride and his heart even heavier from the revelations of the night. Richard stepped down beside him, his boots crunching on the gravel. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, staring at the horses shifting restlessly in the pastures beyond. Henry stood in silence, waiting, the cool Montana air chilling his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. He wanted answers, but he also feared them, for he sensed that whatever truth Richard carried would change everything he thought he knew about his life. "Come with me," Richard said at last. He led Henry away from the main house, down a lantern-lit path that curved past the barns, and into a smaller clearing where the night felt darker, more intimate. They stopped at a weathered wooden bench beneath an old cottonwood tree. Richard gestured for Henry to sit. For a while neither spoke. The only sounds were the chirr of crickets and the distant call of a coyote. Finally, Richard turned, his grey eyes fixed on Henry's face. "There's something you must know," he said, his voice heavy. "Something Samuel never told you, something I should have spoken of years ago." Henry's chest tightened, his fingers dug into the bench. "Go on," Richard exhaled, steadying himself. "When Samuel found you, he wasn't the only one there. I was with him. We came across you near the creek at the edge of his property. You were no more than 3 years old, barefoot, hungry, abandoned. Samuel didn't hesitate for a second. He lifted you into his arms, and from that moment on, you were his." Henry's breath caught. He had always known Samuel took him in as an orphan, but to hear that Richard had been a witness that another pair of eyes had seen that moment made it suddenly real in a way it had never been. "You saw me," Henry whispered, almost disbelieving. "I did," Richard said, his voice trembling now. "I remember Samuel holding you, promising you'd never be alone again. I remember the way Blaze nuzzled against you, as if even the horse recognized you were meant to belong there. I remember thinking you were lucky that even without a family, you had found a man like Samuel to protect you." Henry stared at the ground, overwhelmed. "And yet, you left. You disappeared. For all these years, I thought no one remembered I even existed." Pain flickered in Richard's eyes. "I was only a boy myself. My father despised the time I spent there, said it was beneath me. When he sent me overseas, I had no choice but to obey. By the time I returned, Samuel was gone, the farm was gone, and you had vanished. I tried to find you, Henry. I did. But you had moved on, and the trail was cold. I carried the memory of you, but I let it slip into silence." Henry's hands trembled. He thought of the lonely years after Samuel's death, the endless work, the hollow ache of being unseen. All this time, he had believed himself a forgotten shadow. To know Richard had remembered him, that Samuel's love was witnessed and carried by another, struck him with both comfort and fury. "Why now?" Henry demanded, his voice raw. "Why wait until tonight? Why let me suffer all these years thinking I was nothing, when you knew different?" Richard's expression twisted with regret. "Because I was a coward. Because I thought perhaps you had built a better life and didn't need me dragging up the past. But when I saw you at that auction, standing there with your hand raised, holding on to a dream when everyone mocked you, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. You were the boy Samuel believed in, and I realized I still believed in you too." Henry turned away, tears stinging his eyes. He saw again the faces of Tommy Reed and his friends, their laughter slicing through him. He thought of Mary, urging him to keep the promise. And now this man, tied to Samuel by blood, telling him he had never been forgotten. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Samuel once told me that promises have a way of surviving even when men fail. He said they pass from one heart to another, waiting for the right moment to be fulfilled. Tonight, I believe that moment has come." Henry looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Richard replied, "that Samuel's promise to you is still alive, and tomorrow you'll see how." The night closed in around them, thick with unspoken weight. Henry sat motionless, the truth still sinking in, while Richard rose and gestured toward the barns. "Come, you'll need rest. The morning will bring answers." As Henry followed reluctantly, he felt the pieces of his life shifting in ways he had never imagined. For 50 years, his story had been one of solitude, of promises made and promises broken. Now, with Richard's words still echoing, he realized that perhaps the story was only just beginning. Dawn broke over the valley in streaks of rose and gold, the air crisp with the scent of dew and sage. Henry woke in a small guest room of Richard Cole's ranch house. the unfamiliar comfort of a feather bed beneath him. For years, he had known nothing but the thin mattress in his own cabin, sagging and patched with quilts Mary had sewn long ago. To wake here, in a place filled with warmth and quiet abundance, was both disorienting and humbling. He dressed slowly, tugging on his worn boots and smoothing the wrinkles from his shirt. Outside, the ranch stirred with life. The lowing of cattle drifted from the far fields, while the neighing of horses carried across the morning air. Somewhere nearby, men called to one another as they saddled up for the day's work. The place was alive in a way Henry hadn't felt in years, pulsing with the rhythm of people and animals moving in harmony. Richard waited for him by the porch, his broad frame silhouetted against the rising Sunday. "Come," he said simply, motioning toward the pastures. They walked side by side down a path lined with wooden fences. To Henry's right, rows of barns stretched long and sturdy, each roof catching the light of morning. To his left, fields opened wide, dotted with cattle and sheep, but it was the sight ahead that stole his breath, a sweeping pasture where dozens of horses grazed, their coats shining in hues of chestnut, bay, gray, and black. The herd moved as one, graceful even in their stillness, a living tide of strength and beauty. Henry stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide. "Lord Almighty," he whispered, "I haven't seen a sight like this since Samuel's farm." Richard's face softened. "They're my pride, more than any cattle or land I own. Horses were Samuel's gift to me. He taught me to respect them, to listen to them. I've carried that lesson all my life." They leaned against the fence, watching as a young stallion broke into a gallop, his hooves drumming the earth like thunder. The rest of the herd stirred, some tossing their heads, others joining him in bursts of motion. Henry felt the ground tremble faintly beneath his boots, and for a fleeting moment he was a boy again, running across fields beside Blaze, hearing Samuel's voice in the wind. Richard glanced at him. "Do you feel it?" Henry nodded, his throat too tight to answer. They continued down the path, and Richard spoke again, his tone deliberate. "I built this ranch because I wanted a place that echoed Samuel's spirit, not in wealth or grandeur, but in the way he lived close to the land, close to the animals. Every horse here carries a piece of that legacy, and I believe one of them carries a piece of yours." Henry frowned, uncertain. "Mine? I've no claim to any of this." Richard stopped walking, turning to face him squarely. "You do, because Samuel's dream didn't end with him. It lived in you, and it has lived in me, though I tried for too long to bury it. Now it's time to honor it, together." Henry's pulse quickened. He looked back at the herd, their bodies glistening with sweat as they moved across the field. A mare paused to gaze at him, her ears flicking forward, her calm eyes steady. He felt the weight of her stare, as though she were measuring his soul. "Richard," Henry began, then faltered. The words felt too heavy, too impossible. "I don't know if I'm worthy. I've wasted years, failed at every turn. The world mocked me for even trying." Richard's voice was firm, but kind. "That's where they're wrong. You didn't waste years, you survived them, and you didn't fail. You carried a promise through grief and hardship when others would have let it die. That's not failure, Henry. That's faith." Henry swallowed hard, his eyes burning. He turned back toward the herd, watching the horses with a longing he could not name. He felt Mary's voice echo within him, the same words she had whispered in her final days. "Don't let the dream die with me." And now, standing here, it was as if the dream itself stretched before him, alive and breathing. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "This ranch is more than mine. It's Samuel's legacy, and I believe it's your destiny too. There's something I want to show you tonight, something I think Samuel himself would have chosen for you. But first, you must spend the day. Here, walk the land, see the horses, remember what it feels like." Henry nodded slowly, overwhelmed. He spent the hours that followed moving through the ranch, touching the warm wood of the fences, listening to the calls of ranch hands, watching the horses run with wild freedom. Each sound, each sight, pierced him with a bittersweet mix of memory and hope. As dusk approached, Richard returned, his expression solemn. "It's time," he said. "There's one more truth, Henry, and it waits for you in the valley." The two men walked down the slope together, lanterns swinging in their hands, their shadows long against the earth. Ahead, the pasture glowed in the light of the setting sun, and the herd gathered near the fence, restless, as if sensing something momentous was about to unfold. Henry's heart pounded with anticipation and fear. The past and present pressed in around him, converging in this place, on this night. Whatever secret Richard carried, Henry knew it would change everything once more, and this time he was ready to hear it. The valley spread wide before them, bathed in the deep amber glow of twilight. Lanterns swung from posts along the fences, their flames flickering in the breeze, casting long shadows across the grass. The herd of horses shifted restlessly, as though the earth itself hummed with anticipation. Henry walked beside Richard in silence, his boots crunching against the gravel, his chest tight with a mixture of dread and longing. They stopped at the wooden gate. Beyond it, the pasture opened like an endless ocean of grass, dotted with the silhouettes of the herd. Richard leaned against the gate, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light of day bled into indigo night. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard broke the silence. "Henry," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, "this is where the promise comes alive." Henry gripped the top rail, his knuckles white. He could feel his heart hammering. "What do you mean?" Richard gestured toward the herd. "All my life I've collected horses, but I've never kept them for their bloodlines or their worth at market. I've chosen them because I believed Samuel would have chosen them, and tonight I want you to choose one. Not because you need charity, not because I pity you, but because Samuel's promise belongs to you." Henry's breath caught. The words settled in his chest like a stone and a spark all at once. For decades, he had dreamed of this moment, only to watch it vanish again and again. And now, here it was offered not by chance, but by the hand of Samuel's kin, under the same wide sky that had once carried Samuel's lessons. He shook his head, overwhelmed. "I can't. It's too much." "You don't know what you're asking." Richard placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Yes, I do. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to believe that your life has not been wasted, that Samuel's faith in you was never misplaced, that Mary's words to you were not in vain. I'm asking you to honor them." Henry's knees felt weak. His throat ached as he whispered, "But what if I'm not strong enough anymore? What if I fail again?" Richard's grip tightened. "Then you fail trying, and that is worth more than surrender." The gate creaked as Richard pushed it open. The herd lifted their heads, ears twitching, eyes glowing in the lantern light. For a long moment, Henry stood frozen at the threshold, the weight of half a century pressing down on him. Every humiliation, every loss, every empty night alone, they all crowded in at once. But then he remembered Mary's voice, fragile yet unwavering. "Don't let the dream die with me." He remembered Samuel's steady gaze. "One day, you'll have a horse of your own." The words pulsed through him, a heartbeat louder than his fear. Slowly, Henry stepped into the pasture. The grass whispered beneath his boots, and the air felt charged, alive. The herd shifted around him, some backing away, others watching curiously. He moved carefully, his breath shallow, as if afraid to disturb the sacred silence. One by one, the horses revealed themselves, sleek bays, proud blacks, dappled grays. Each was magnificent, yet none stirred his soul. Then, from the edge of the herd, a chestnut mare stepped forward. Her coat gleamed like fire under the rising moon, her eyes wide and unflinching. She walked toward him with a calm certainty, as though she had been waiting for this moment as long as he had. Henry's chest tightened. He extended a trembling hand, his breath catching when the mare lowered her head and pressed her muzzle gently into his palm. Her warmth seeped into him, steady and grounding, dissolving the weight of his years in a single heartbeat. "She's chosen you," Richard said softly behind him. Henry's vision blurred, the world tilted, and for a moment he felt the presence of Samuel standing tall beside him, Blaze grazing in the distance, and Mary smiling through the silver veil of the stars. Tears slipped down his weathered cheeks, falling onto the mare's mane as he whispered, "Blaze, Mary, I kept the promise." The mare snorted softly, her breath warm against his hand, and Henry let out a choked laugh that was half sob, half joy. He leaned against her, his heart swelling with something he thought he had lost forever: belonging. Behind him, Richard's voice carried steady in the quiet night. "This is your defining moment, Henry. The moment Samuel saw in you all those years ago. The moment Mary believed in until her last breath. Take it, live it, ride it." Henry closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the mare's neck. For the first time in half a century, he felt whole. The night had deepened by the time Henry stepped back through the gate, the chestnut mare following close behind him like a shadow of fire and grace. The lanterns flickered against her coat, turning her every movement into molten copper. Richard watched from the fence line, his expression unreadable but his eyes bright with something between pride and sorrow. Henry's legs trembled, his whole body felt heavy with exhaustion, yet his spirit soared with a strength he hadn't known in years. The mare's breath puffed against his shoulder, as though reassuring him, grounding him in the moment. He ran a hand down her sleek neck, feeling the rhythm of her life thrumming through her veins. For the first time in decades, he felt he wasn't walking alone. Richard approached slowly, his boots crunching in the gravel. "Her name is Hope," he said softly. "I chose it long before tonight, though I didn't know why. Now I see it was meant for you." Henry swallowed hard, his throat raw. "Hope," he repeated, the word tasting new and sacred on his tongue. He looked into the mare's steady eyes and whispered, "So it was always you, always waiting for me." Richard laid a hand on the gate. "She isn't just any horse, Henry. She came to me from a small breeder in Wyoming who said she was born with a strange calmness, as though she carried something greater than herself. I bought her because she reminded me of Blaze Samuel's Blaze. Now, looking at you with her, I know why I kept her." Henry stroked Hope's muzzle, his heart aching with gratitude and disbelief. "It's like Samuel sent her here himself, like Mary guided me to this night." They stood in silence for a long while, man, horse, and witness bound together beneath the stars. The ranch had quieted, the bunkhouse lamps were dim, the voices of the ranch hands gone. Only the sounds of the crickets and the soft shifting of the herd in the pasture remained. Richard finally broke the silence. "You know what this means, don't you?" Henry turned, his voice hoarse. "That I finally kept my promise." "That and more," Richard said firmly. "This isn't just about fulfilling a vow. It's about remembering who you are. You are not a man broken by poverty or mocked into silence. You are the boy Samuel believed in, the husband Mary loved, the farmer who carried faith through a lifetime of hardship. And now, with this horse, you are whole again." Henry's vision blurred. He pressed his forehead to Hope's neck, inhaling the earthy scent of her coat. His tears wet her mane, but she did not flinch. Instead, she stood still, a steady presence, as though she knew her role was not to move but to anchor him. He whispered, "I thought I was too late. I thought the world had passed me by. But you're proof that faith never dies." Hope nudged him gently, and Henry let out a shaky laugh. "You understand, don't you? You know who I am." Richard stepped closer. "Tomorrow we'll ride. You'll feel the wind on your face again. You'll hear the thunder of hooves beneath you. And you'll know beyond doubt that the promise is alive." Henry nodded, his chest swelling with anticipation. Yet in the quiet of his soul, another voice stirred Mary's voice, soft and enduring. "Every time the earth shakes beneath hooves, I'll be there." He closed his eyes, and for an instant he felt her presence beside him, her hand warm in his, her smile as real as the stars above. The night drew on, but Henry could not bring himself to leave Hope's side. Long after Richard returned to the house, Henry remained by the fence, whispering to the mare, telling her of Samuel, of Mary, of years of toil and loss. She listened with unblinking eyes, ears twitching as though absorbing every word. At last, when fatigue threatened to overcome him, Henry laid his hand one final time on her neck. "Tomorrow, Hope. Tomorrow we ride." The mare gave a soft whinny, as though answering. Henry turned toward the guest house, his steps lighter than they had been in years. For the first time in half a century, he carried not just the memory of a promise, but the living proof of its fulfillment walking at his side. And in that moment, he realized something deeper. The horse was not only his salvation, she was his faith made flesh, the embodiment of every prayer whispered into the night, every tear shed into the soil, every ounce of love that had kept him standing. Hope was not just his horse, she was his resurrection. The morning broke crisp and bright, the sky washed clean by the cool night air. Henry stood in the yard of Richard Cole's ranch, Hope saddled and ready, her copper coat gleaming in the Sunday. His fingers fumbled with the reins, clumsy after so many years, but the mare was patient, steady beneath his touch. He felt as if she knew he was not just preparing for a ride, he was preparing for a reckoning. Richard approached, carrying himself with calm authority. "It's time," he said simply. His voice carried no doubt, only certainty. "You don't have to prove anything to me, but you deserve to prove something to yourself and to them." Henry nodded, his heart hammered against his ribs. He hadn't ridden since Blaze, since boyhood days when Samuel had lifted him onto a saddle and told him the earth would always welcome a man who rode with honesty. Today he would ride not as a boy clinging to hope, but as an old man reclaiming it. Mounting hope was like stepping into another life. The leather creaked beneath him, the smell of horse and saddle filling his lungs. When she shifted, he felt her strength through his bones, a power so alive it seemed to carry him higher than the ground itself. He tightened his grip on the reins, and for the first time in half a century, Henry Walker was not standing on weary legs, he was astride a horse of his own. They set out toward town, Richard driving a carriage behind him. The dirt road stretched long and winding, bordered by fields still wet with morning dew. Hope's hooves struck the earth with steady rhythm, each beat echoing like a drum in Henry's chest. With every mile, the every 5 years seemed to peel away. He could almost hear Samuel's voice guiding him, almost feel Mary's hand resting gently against his back. By the time they crested the final hill overlooking the town, Henry's pulse had steadied into something new, resolve. Below, the familiar streets stirred with the bustle of another day, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, children chasing one another through the dust, townsfolk gathering in the square. But as Henry rode down the main street, the ordinary morning froze into silence. Heads turned, conversations faltered. Every eye fixed on the sight of the poor farmer who had been humiliated only nights ago, now riding a magnificent chestnut mare with her head high and stride proud. Hope's coat blazed in the sunlight, her every movement commanding attention. Henry sat taller in the saddle than he had stood in years. His patched shirt and weathered hat no longer made him look small. They framed him as a man unshaken, a man who carried something the wealthy had never possessed: dignity. At the corner cafe, a group of men fell silent mid-laughter. Among them was Tommy Reed, his swagger gone, his mouth parting in disbelief. The same young man who had mocked Henry into silence now sat frozen, unable to find a word. His companions shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh again or bow their heads. Henry guided Hope forward, the mare's hooves striking firm against the cobblestones. He didn't look down at Tommy, didn't offer a word. His silence was louder than any insult could have been. The people lining the street seemed to feel it too, respect rippling through the crowd, a quiet acknowledgement that something greater than wealth had ridden into town. Children pointed, their voices breaking the stillness. "Look at the horse, look at him ride." One little boy clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide with awe. Henry reined Hope to a gentle halt, leaning slightly in the saddle. He tipped his hat to the boy, his voice carrying clear but kind. "Son, remember this, no dream is too small, and no promise is ever too old." The boy's face lit up, and his mother's eyes softened with tears. Around them, murmurs swelled, the weight of Henry's words settling into the hearts of those who had once overlooked him. Richard's carriage rolled up beside him, the older man sitting tall behind the reins. He looked at Henry, pride unmistakable in his gaze. For a moment, the two men, bound by Samuel, by memory, by the same unbroken promise, shared a silence richer than any applause. Henry urged Hope forward once more, the mare moving with grace through the town. He felt the eyes on him, but they no longer burned with mockery or pity. They burned with recognition. He was no longer the broken man who had left the auction in shame. He was Henry Walker, a man who had carried faith through the fire of loss and come out whole. As he and Hope reached the far edge of town, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. Henry lifted his face into it, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He could hear Mary's laughter, faint but certain, mingling with the rhythm of Hope's stride. For the first time in decades, the world felt right, and though he rode away in silence, the town behind him buzzed with whispers that would not soon fade. The town had returned to its rhythm, yet the image of Henry Walker riding through on the chestnut mare lingered like a tale too powerful to fade. By evening, whispers of what had happened spread from the cafe to the blacksmith's shop, from the church steps to the schoolhouse yard. Men who had once dismissed Henry's stubbornness now spoke in low tones of his quiet dignity, and women who had pitied his loneliness found themselves moved by his perseverance. But it was the children who carried the story most eagerly, their voices ringing with awe. "Did you see him? Did you see the old man on the beautiful horse?" Henry meanwhile rode Hope along the edges of the town until he reached the small park where families often gathered in the evenings. The autumn air was cool, scented with pine and chimney smoke. He dismounted carefully, his knees stiff but his movements steady, and led Hope to the fence line where a cluster of children had gathered, wide-eyed and restless with excitement. A little boy, the same one who had pointed earlier in the day, stepped forward timidly, his hands clutched at his mother's skirt. But his gaze never left Hope. "Mister," he said, his voice trembling with both nerves and wonder, "she's the most beautiful horse I've ever seen." Henry bent slightly, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "She is, isn't she? Her name's Hope." The boy repeated the name softly, as though it were a secret worth keeping. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a small apple he had saved, offering it to the child. "Here, let her take it from your hand." The boy's eyes went wide, but with Henry guiding him, he held the apple out. Hope lowered her head gently, her warm breath tickling his fingers before her soft lips plucked the fruit away. The boy gasped and looked up at Henry with sheer joy lighting his face. Henry rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. His voice carried enough for the others to hear, yet it was spoken with tenderness. "Remember this, son. No dream is too small, and no promise is ever too old. If you hold on, no matter how long it takes, someday it will find you." The words sank deep, rippling through the group of children. One girl whispered to another, repeating them as though they were sacred. The mothers watched with quiet smiles, while the fathers who stood nearby lowered their hats in respect. For all the years Henry had been ignored or ridiculed, tonight his voice carried weight. It was no longer just the voice of a poor farmer. It was the voice of a man who had endured and triumphed, and in doing so, had become a symbol of something larger than himself. Richard Cole, who had followed on foot, observed the scene from a distance. His expression softened as he watched Henry kneel to speak with the children, his calloused hands gentle, his words deliberate and kind. He thought of Samuel then, how his uncle had believed in the power of teaching through example, of showing rather than telling. Henry had learned that lesson well, and now he was passing it forward. As the evening deepened, lanterns were lit along the street. Henry mounted Hope once more, and the crowd parted instinctively, not with scorn or laughter this time, but with reverence. The boy who had fed Hope ran alongside for a few steps, waving eagerly. Henry tipped his hat once more, smiling down at him, before guiding Hope toward the open road. The sound of her hooves echoed in the quiet, steady and sure. With each step, Henry felt the weight of years falling further behind him. He had returned not only with dignity restored, but with a message planted in the hearts of those who would live long after him. Perhaps that was Samuel's true intention all along, not just for Henry to keep a promise, but to show others what it meant to never surrender one's faith. Above them, the first stars appeared, bright against the indigo sky. Henry looked upward, his eyes glistening. He thought of Mary again, her voice lingering like a prayer in the wind. "Every time the earth shakes beneath hooves, I'll be there." And he believed it, utterly. Hope flicked her ears back, as if she too heard the whisper. Henry leaned forward, stroking her neck. "We're not done yet, girl. There's still one more ride to make." With that, he urged her onward, the town lights fading behind them as horse and rider disappeared into the vastness of the prairie, carrying with them a promise kept and a message that would outlive them both. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the fading light, golden grass rippling like waves under the evening wind. Henry rode at an easy pace, Hope's stride, steady and powerful beneath him. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in shades of crimson and violet, while the first stars began to prick the sky. Every hoofbeat was a reminder. He was no longer the man who had walked away from the auction in shame. He was riding home not to a place, but to himself. Richard's carriage followed at a distance, its lantern swinging softly, but Henry was scarcely aware of it. He was lost in the rhythm of the ride, the smell of horse and earth, the rush of air against his weathered face. He felt Mary beside him, her laughter in the wind, and Samuel's steady voice rising from the soil. They were gone, yet here, absent, yet closer than ever. When they crested a hill overlooking the town, Henry reined Hope to a halt. Below, the streets shimmered with lamplight, and though the sounds of the day had faded, he could still sense the echoes of the whispers that had followed him earlier. He thought of the children's wide eyes, of the boy's trembling hand as he fed Hope the apple. He thought of the way the crowd had parted, no longer in pity or ridicule, but in respect. For a long moment he sat in silence, his hand resting lightly on Hope's neck. "We did it," he whispered. "It took 50 years, but we did it." Hope flicked her ears, her breath warm in the cool evening. Henry smiled, the lines of hardship softening as joy replaced them. "Mary," he said softly, looking to the stars, "I kept the promise. Samuel, I kept it, and I am whole again." He urged Hope forward once more, and together they descended into town. The streets were quieter now, but a few townsfolk lingered on porches, and when they saw him ride past, they tipped their hats or gave small nods of acknowledgement. No words were needed. The gesture itself carried all the respect Henry had long been denied. At the cafe, Tommy Reed and his companions still sat outside, their laughter subdued, their bravado dimmed. They straightened as Henry passed, their eyes widening as if still unable to believe what they were seeing. Henry did not slow, did not speak. He merely looked ahead, his back straight, his presence a silent rebuke louder than any insult could be. For the first time in his young life, Tommy Reed said nothing. Farther down the street, a young boy again, the same child from before, saw Henry and ran to the edge of the boardwalk, waving frantically. Mister, will you ride through again tomorrow?" Henry laughed, a sound rich and unguarded. He pulled Hope to a stop and leaned down slightly, his smile warm. "Maybe I will, son, maybe I will. But you remember what I told you, no dream is too small, and no promise is ever too old." The boy nodded eagerly, as though the words had carved themselves into his heart forever. His mother pulled him close, tears glimmering in her eyes, and Henry tipped his hat before guiding Hope onward. Richard's carriage drew alongside him as they left the town behind, and for a moment the two men rode together, one on horseback, the other holding the reins of a wagon. Richard looked over at Henry, his voice steady. "You've closed the circle, my friend. Samuel would be proud, Mary too." Henry's eyes shone, though he blinked the tears away. "I feel them here, both of them. I thought I was alone, but I never was." They rode on into the quiet night, the ranch lights glimmering ahead like a beacon. Henry felt the weight of years fall from his shoulders, leaving only the truth, that love, faith, and promises kept were worth more than gold, more than land, more than the laughter of those who mocked him. When they reached the open pasture again, Henry dismounted and let Hope graze freely. He stood with Richard at the fence line, staring into the star-swept sky. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faintest whisper, or perhaps only the memory of one, "Welcome home." Henry smiled through his tears. The circle had closed, and within it he had found not just a horse, not just redemption, but peace. And now, tell me, what do you think about Henry's journey? If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. I'll know you were here. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will bring you even more powerful moments between people and the animals that change their lives forever.